It's Friday, it's 12:15 and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran. This week.
Everybody else has apologised for him, but he won't apologise for himself. A coward, not a leader.
The right honourable gentleman is now trying to prosecute others for exactly the course of action that he took himself.
Minister, Prime Minister, sit down, Prime Minister.
Tense exchanges at PMQs over MPs' conduct. Former Yorkshire player Azim Rafiq tells MPs that English cricket is institutionally racist.
There's a real problem here, not just Yorkshire, throughout the country, and I'm going to be the one that's going to speak about this.
After those climate change talks in Glasgow, should plans for a new oil field in Scotland be scrapped?
Cambo cannot go ahead. There is no rigorous climate change test that Cambo can possibly pass.
I don't think that Cambo should get the green light. I am not the one taking that decision.
The government's new rail plan scales back commitments for high-speed rail in the north of England.
I'm proud to announce our integrated rail plan, which will transform rail services in the North and the Midlands.
He promised that the North would not be forgotten. But he hasn't just forgotten us, he's completely sold us out.
Welcome. Let's start with that row on MPs' conduct and outside earnings that's been continuing to rumble on here in Westminster. Sean, what's been going on?
This is a never-ending row, really. It's been more than a fortnight since Boris Johnson ordered his MPs to vote for a proposal which suspended a punishment that had been handed down to Owen Paterson, who was a Conservative former minister who'd been found to have broken lobbying rules. And at the same time, the Prime Minister wanted his MPs to approve plans for a new committee that would have a look at the standards system in Parliament. Well, that caused a huge row, and really the government have been on the retreat ever since. The next day, they apologised, more or less. That was the leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, not Boris Johnson.
Yep.
And Owen Paterson resigned as an MP. He's no longer an MP. There was an emergency debate a couple of days later, but everything was still up in the air because MPs were left with a committee that consisted of a few Conservative MPs and nobody else because the other parties wouldn't take part in it. And there was still this question mark of what to do about this standards committee into Owen Paterson. So the government came up with a parliamentary device, which is a little bit like a parliamentary time machine. A motion on the order paper. All MPs had to do was approve this, and then everything, they would be travelling back in time. It would be as though the previous few days had never happened. There'd be no question about the report and there'd be no committee. But it didn't go quite to plan.
We now come to a motion relating to the Committee on Standards, and I call the Minister to move formally.
Object.
Objection taken.
Wow.
Mr Wishart, point of order.
Mr Deputy Speaker, we've just passed probably one of the most significant motions that this House has considered in the past 2 weeks, motion number 6 in the Committee of Standards. There has been no opportunity to debate this at all. They've brought forward this on Standing Order number 9, subsection 6. There has been no opportunity to have this debated in the House at all. I'm looking for your advice, Mr Deputy Speaker, to see how we can have the Leader of the House come to this House and explain what he's doing.
Somebody shouted object. I took the objection. It will now be up to the government then to reprogram that particular motion. So we're moving on.
Sean, Nigel Evans sitting in the Speaker's chair, his face was a picture, wasn't it, in response to the Conservative MP Christopher Chope shouting out object, and then he obviously had to follow through with procedure. Where did that leave the government?
Well, basically, this all came about because the government had put down this motion and they said on the order paper that if we get to this after 10 o'clock, there's no debate. So it's a take it or leave it sort of option, or as they say, a nod or nothing. You either nod it through or nothing happens. Because Sir Christopher Chope, a Conservative backbencher, shouted object, they couldn't go forward. And so what happened was that the government then had to find time the next day for a short debate on the motion, which, as we say, took everything back to the way it was before that original vote a couple of weeks ago.
Today's motion rescinds the House's decision of the 3rd of November to appoint an ad hoc committee. It also approves the third report of the Committee on Standards, while noting Owen Paterson is no longer a member of the House. Mr. Speaker, I have listened carefully to the views expressed since the debate and decision on the 3rd of November, and I want to make it clear that members of Parliament must uphold the highest standards in public life. I think it was simply the tragedy that afflicted Mr. Paterson coloured and clouded our judgment and my judgment incorrectly. And it is as simple and as sad as that.
Standards matter. Scrutiny matters. An independent system of holding everyone in public life to account matters. Standards should not be seen or treated as an irksome bother that you get your mates to change when you're found out. It should not be seen as something to be feared or something to be treated with such disdain, frankly incompetence and a total absence of leadership as we've seen from this sorry government over this sorry affair.
I read the report of the Committee on Standards into Owen Paterson. I believe the conclusion was clear and fair. Owen Paterson broke the rules on paid advocacy. And the attempt by right honourable and honourable members of this House, aided and abetted by the government, under cover of reform of the process, effectively to clear his name, was misplaced, ill-judged and just plain wrong.
Theresa May not holding back there, Sean. And as we saw in the headlines, and perhaps unsurprisingly, this whole saga was always going to be the focus at Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday.
Yes, because, of course, this is a row that has blown up, really, and it's led to headlines pretty well every day, and there have been news stories, and it's expanded looking at MPs' second job. So it's caused a lot of anger on both sides of the House. It's caused a rift between Boris Johnson and his own MPs. So it was inevitable, really, I think, that it was going to dominate Prime Minister's questions. A very bad-tempered affair, which was interesting for lots of reasons, not least because, as we'll hear, the Speaker got involved. He ended up rebuking the Prime Minister on 4 occasions during the half an hour. And also because, interestingly, there were a lot of empty spaces on the Conservative benches. A lot of Conservative MPs, annoyed by the events of the last couple of weeks, simply didn't turn up to back Boris Johnson when he was at the dispatch box.
There is now agreement that Owen Paterson broke the rules and that the government should not have tried to let him off the hook. Will he do the decent thing and just say sorry for trying to give the green light to corruption?
No one should exploit their position in order to advance the commercial interests of anybody else. That's our position, Mr. Speaker. We want to take forward those reforms. In the meantime, perhaps he could clear up from his proposals, whether he would continue to be able to take money as he did from Mishcon de Rea and other legal firms.
That's not an apology. Everybody else has apologised for him, but he won't apologise for himself. A coward, not a leader. Weeks defending corruption.
The right honourable gentleman is now trying to prosecute others for exactly the course of action that he took himself. And what I think the nation wants to know, because his register is incomplete, who paid Mishcon de Rea and who paid the 25,000? Who's paying him for his?
We know that Owen Paterson was a paid lobbyist for Randox. We know that he sat in on a call between Randox and the minister responsible for handling health contracts. We know that Randox has been awarded government contracts worth almost £600 million without competition or tender. Against that backdrop, the public are concerned that taxpayers' money may have been influenced by paid lobbying. There's only one way to get to the bottom of this: a full, transparent investigation.
Prime Minister! I'm very happy to publish all the details of the Randox contracts, which have been investigated by the National Audit Office already. We're talking of cover-ups. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but we still have not heard why the Honourable Gentleman will not tell...
Order. Prime Minister, sit down. Prime Minister, I'm not going to be challenged. You may be the Prime Minister of this country, but in this House, I'm in charge, and we're going to carry on. End of that.
I've just received on the wires that the Leader of the Opposition, and I didn't hear this at the time because of so much noise, called the Prime Minister a coward. Surely that is in breach of Erskine May and improper and should be withdrawn.
I withdraw it. But he's no leader.
So the parliamentary rules are pretty strict. There's a whole list of things that you are not allowed to call another MP, and Keir Starmer had fallen foul of those rules by calling the Prime Minister a coward. Now, you might think, listening to the way he responded there, that perhaps he'd been waiting to be pulled up, and perhaps he thought the Speaker would have stepped in earlier on and allowed him to deliver that response there where he withdrew the word but kept the other part of his attack. As it was, because it was so noisy, the Speaker said he hadn't heard it, so it was right at the end that the Leader of the Opposition was pulled up and offered that withdrawal of the allegation of cowardice.
And Boris Johnson had a busy day, of course, in Parliament on Wednesday, because after PMQs, he was then later on questioned by senior MPs on this issue and a whole range of other issues.
That's right, yes. There's a group of senior MPs, people who chair committees, and they come together to form the Liaison Committee. They're the parliamentary equivalent, I suppose, of the 1970s supergroup, where everybody comes together, possibly less musical. And they come together, and they don't always ask questions in tune either, it has to be said. But they come together and they question the Prime Minister at intervals throughout the year. And this is a much more detailed cross-examination of the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson was in front of them for a couple of hours. There was a big range of topics. They asked him about the budget, they asked him about COP26, there were some questions about violence against women, so a lot of very serious topics. But inevitably, the session started with questions about standards and the way he had handled events over the past couple of weeks.
Can I just ask you, because I don't quite understand, do you think that Owen Paterson was guilty or not?
I think it was a very sad case, but I think there's no question that he had fallen foul of the rules on paid advocacy as far as I could see from the report. I think the question that people wanted to establish was whether or not, given the particularly tragic circumstances, he'd had a fair right to appeal. And
he had an appeal. His appeal was heard endlessly, both by the committee.
Yes, Mr. Brown, I wish to restate that informing the impression that the former member for North Shropshire had not had a fair process, I may well have been mistaken. But that was certainly the impression that many people seem to have.
Theresa May said yesterday that your actions over this case were misplaced, ill-judged and just plain wrong.
Well, I think I've said several times now that I do think it was a mistake to conflate, as we did, those two things. A particularly difficult case. It's not often in our House of Commons when a colleague suffers a family bereavement in the course of an investigation. There was quite a lot of feeling about it, and for that reason, in a spirit of compassion, I thought it might be useful to see whether there was any cross-party support.
But you didn't approach cross-party at all, did you? You told John Whittingdale that there was a cross-party agreement to set up this committee, but that wasn't the case, was it?
So it would seem.
So Boris Johnson under some pressure there in front of the Liaison Committee. But where does it leave the debate about the rules and standards on MPs' outside work and earnings?
Well, the debate certainly isn't over. As the Prime Minister was being cross-examined there, MPs were debating a Labour attempt to ban almost all second jobs for MPs. But on Wednesday night, at the end of the debate, Labour's proposals were defeated and a government amendment was accepted which would stop MPs taking political consultancies. But there is still some way to go here because that committee, cross-party committee, chaired by Chris Bryant, who we've just heard, they are going to now be looking at the MP's code of conduct and they're expected to come back with proposals by the end of January. So I think there is still quite a lot of life left in this argument and we will be hearing more about it again.
And we'll be hearing more from you in a few minutes' time. But let's go to the Scottish Parliament. Let's go to Edinburgh, Holyrood, where our reporter Jenny Davidson can tell us what has been happening. Jenny, members have again been talking about the Scottish Government's vaccine passport scheme and whether or not it's going to be extended. What's happened?
Well, we were expecting to hear on Tuesday about whether it had been extended, and the scheme at the moment just covers nightclubs and large events where people have to show proof that they've been vaccinated. But actually the decision on whether to expand it has been delayed for another week. On Tuesday, in a COVID update, the First Minister did express concerns about the number of COVID cases and warned again that it might be expanded to venues such as cinemas, theatres, other hospitality, but she stopped short of an actual announcement. However, she did mention, interestingly, that lateral flow tests, some proof of negative lateral flow test might be brought in as an alternative to proof of vaccine status.
Today, the public were expecting a statement that delivered clear decisions. We all were. That was the message the Deputy First Minister was sent out to give this Parliament last week. Instead, we're being told once more to wait until next week. The Government has delayed again, creating wholly avoidable uncertainty. Businesses are once again being left in the dark and treated as an afterthought. They might have less than 2 weeks to adapt to changes to the vaccine passport scheme at one of the busiest times of the year for the hospitality industry. And this has a big impact on their staff as well. It is a total lack of respect for Scottish businesses who the SNP expect to shoulder the costs of their vaccine passport scheme.
Presiding Officer, it pains me to say this, but the immaturity and irresponsibility of Douglas Ross in the face of this virus continues to be utterly breathtaking. Is he, I know he's had other things in his mind in recent days, but is he oblivious to what is currently happening across Europe, where this virus is on the rise again, and governments everywhere are once again having to grapple with the most difficult decisions? We are seeking to do that in a responsible way. That's what we have done throughout, and we will continue to do that in the period ahead.
Yes, so no definite decision as yet, but we will for sure know on Tuesday. There will be an announcement this coming Tuesday on whether this expansion of the scheme is to go ahead. And if it does, it's expected to start on the 6th of December.
Well, we'll keep an ear out for that, of course, Jenny. Members have also been talking about this rather controversial possible new oil field near Shetland. What have we learnt about that?
Well, yes, so the Cambo oil field's about 75 miles west of Shetland, and it's a new oil field that may or may not be licensed. And obviously, environmental campaigners are saying at this stage we shouldn't be licensing new oil fields when we're trying to move away from fossil fuels. Now, the decision lies with the UK government because it's reserved. Oil and gas is a reserved matter. But the First Minister has still been under pressure to come out in opposition to the oil field. And this week she gave a much stronger, much clearer statement of her views.
If we are serious about averting climate catastrophe and accelerating towards a just transition for a green economy, Cambo cannot go ahead. There is no rigorous climate change test that Cambo can possibly pass. So the First Minister must do more than ask the UK Government to simply reassess the proposed oil fields. Time is running out. Will the First Minister oppose Cambo in the strongest possible terms and provide the political leadership that has been lacking?
First Minister.
Look, I've made my position very clear. I don't think we can go on extracting new oil and gas forever. That's why we've moved away from the policy of maximum economic recovery. And I don't think we can go and continue to give the go-ahead to new oil fields. So I don't think that Cambo should get the green light. I am not the one taking that decision, so I've set out a proposal for a climate assessment, and I think the presumption would be that Cambo couldn't and shouldn't pass any rigorous climate assessment. If I had the power, and Monica Lennon might want to join me in calling for the powers to be transferred to Scotland so that we could actually take these decisions, but given that it's somebody else that has the power, what I've done is set out a process by which a different decision could be arrived at. But as soon as Monica Lennon wants to argue that the power should be in our hands, she'll find a willing ally in me.
Well, her statement has been welcomed by climate campaigners, but the Scottish Conservatives have warned that by not approving this new oil field, it would just mean relying on foreign oil and gas imports, possibly from Russia, which might be less environmentally friendly, and also of a threat to Scottish jobs. The issue came up again at First Minister's questions this week with Scottish Conservative MSP Douglas Lumsden claiming that the First Minister was turning away from 100,000 Scottish jobs in the northeast of Scotland. And you know, Nicola Sturgeon acknowledged this was a difficult and complex issue, and while she didn't want to see unemployment and she didn't want to see imports, we do need to move away from approving new oil and gas fields, she said.
Right, well, that's the debate, as you say, going on about the Cambo oil field near Shetland. The Green Party's Lorna Slater, who's now a minister in the Scottish Government, of course, was asked about plans of a recycling scheme. What was that about?
Yes, this was part of an update on plans for the circular economy towards reducing waste. Now, the Scottish Government has had plans for a bottle and can recycling scheme in the offing for quite a while. The idea is that people could bring their glass bottles or plastic bottles, their drinks cans, back to places such as supermarkets, put them in a kind of reverse vending machine, and they would get money back as a return of their deposit. Now, the scheme was originally meant to be up and running by April this year. It was then delayed due to COVID to July 2022. And then this week, Circular Economy Minister Lorna Slater had to announce that actually it was going to be delayed again, and she mentioned things like Brexit, like COVID, and also discussions with the UK government about VAT on these return deposits.
We recognise that HMRC's position on VAT is challenging, but VAT deposits haven't been a barrier to implementation of deposit return schemes in other European countries. The Minister says the Scottish Government is committed to the scheme being operational as soon as practicably possible. So can she confirm that there will be no delay to the July 2022 implementation date? We know how concerned the Minister was about industry lobbying causing delays to the scheme. So can she confirm what discussion she has had with large-scale producers to ensure that it is they and not local authorities who will foot the bill of any delay? And finally, we acknowledge that the Minister has committed to come back to the Chamber to outline the final timeline, but can she confirm today when she will return to the Chamber?
In terms of the date for the deposit return scheme is a very comprehensive one. It involves tens of thousands of collection points around the country. It involves big retailers, small brewers, our hospitality sector. I am currently engaging with all of those stakeholders to figure out what the shortest practical time is possible to implement this scheme, given the challenges around Brexit and around the pandemic that is currently still raging. This is constant industry engagement. I would also re-emphasise that Circularity Scotland is a non-profit company set up by private sector producers, retailers and wholesalers. This scheme will be implemented by industry for industry. So industry engagement is at the core of this scheme. This is how the scheme will be implemented. It is based on the producer pays principle.
Jenny Davidson at Holyrood, thank you very much. Sean, we saw briefly in the headlines powerful testimony from the former Yorkshire cricketer Azeem Rafiq. He was giving evidence to a select committee, the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. It was actually very upsetting listening to him. What was the background?
Azeem Rafiq was a professional player at Yorkshire. He spent most of his career at the club. He left in 2018. Last year, he said he'd been the victim of institutional racism, and he said his treatment had been so bad that he'd come close to taking his own life. The club launched an investigation, and in September of this year, they published a summary in which they said that Azim Rafiq had indeed been the victim of racial harassment and bullying, but that no disciplinary action was going to be taken against any individuals. MPs on the Culture Committee decided to launch their own inquiry, and the player was one of the witnesses who appeared before them. He spoke for some time. There were breaks because at times he became emotional. He recounted his treatment at the club and some of the abuse he said that he had suffered, and that included being referred to with a racial slur that referred to his Pakistani heritage, and his evidence did include offensive language.
Pretty early on, me and other people from Asian background, there was comments such as, "You lot sit over there near the toilets," elephant washers, the word was used constantly, and there just seems to be an acceptance in the institution from the leaders, and no one ever stamped it out. To be honest, all I wanted to do is play cricket and play cricket for England and live my dream and live my family's dream. End of 2017, we had a really difficult pregnancy, and through that time, the treatment that I received from some of the club officials was inhuman. They weren't really bothered about the fact that I was at training one day and I get a phone call to say there's no heartbeat. Sorry. My first instance of drinking, I actually got pinned down at my local cricket club, and red wine got poured down my throat.
How old were you?
15.
15, you're a Muslim, 15.
15-year-old, I got literally down my throat. The player played for Yorkshire.
So you say it's institutional in Yorkshire. Do you think it's institutional in cricket more widely?
Yes, I do. There's a real problem here, not just Yorkshire, throughout the country. And I'm going to be the one that's going to speak about this.
What would you say to 10, 11-year-old boys in Barnsley and girls in Barnsley today, hearing this, reading this, who might have that same dream?
This is why where we've got to is quite difficult, because I can't even imagine as a parent hearing me speak now why I would ever want my kids to go anywhere near the game. And I don't want my son to go anywhere near cricket.
Well, harrowing evidence there and testimony from the former cricketer Azim Rafiq. Sean, we also heard in that session from other key witnesses.
Yes, the MPs heard from the former chairman of Yorkshire, Roger Hutton, who told them that he conceded that the club was institutionally racist. And they also heard from the sports governing body, the ECB, who admitted that there was a lot of work that they still had to do to improve diversity in the game.
Thanks, Sean. Let's go to the Welsh Parliament, to the Senedd, and speak to our reporter there, Cemlyn Davies. Hello, Cemlyn. There have been more discussions of COVID passes in Wales. We've talked a lot about it on the programme, and it came up at First Minister's Questions this week. What's the latest?
Yes, that's right. And it came up because this was another review week. Every 3 weeks, the Welsh Government has to look at the COVID rules that are in place in Wales and decide what to do about them. And at the last review 3 weeks ago, the First Minister, Labour's Mark Drakeford, had warned that unless the situation improved, that cases fell, that the Welsh Government would have no choice but to consider reintroducing some restrictions. And in particular, he said at that time that the hospitality sector should prepare for the possibility that their customers would have to show a COVID pass to show either that they're fully vaccinated or that they've had a recent negative coronavirus test result. And so that's what led to this exchange during Tuesday's session of First Minister's Questions.
Concerns have rightly been raised about the legal and ethical impacts of COVID passes, and the fact remains that there is no evidence to show that vaccine passports limit the spread of the virus or indeed increases uptake of the vaccine. This week there are genuine fears that the Welsh Government will extend COVID passes out to hospitality settings 2. First Minister, vaccine passports are not a route out of restrictions. They are indeed restrictions.
I remember all the shroud waving from his benches about how we wouldn't be able to do it, about how difficult it would be, what a mess there'd be when we did it. None of that is true. None of that is true. And the member ought to know better than to suggest it. It is done very successfully, very smoothly, and done by people who work hard to protect the Welsh public. It will help to keep businesses open. That's what it's designed to do, and I make no apologies for it whatsoever.
So that was on Tuesday. The Welsh Government has now announced the outcome of its latest review, and what they've said is that the rules will remain as they are for the next 3 weeks at least. But the First Minister has again warned that the option remains open to extend the use of COVID passes to include the hospitality sector if cases rise, and that would be to ensure that pubs and restaurants can stay open over Christmas, the Welsh Government says.
Right, Cemlyn, and members were also talking about how vaccines, COVID vaccines, can be shared more fairly around the world. How did that debate develop and come about?
Yes, and during that debate, we heard more than once the mantra that nobody is safe until everyone is safe. And this debate was brought by Plaid Cymru MS Heledd Vychan.
We in Wales have a responsibility as a higher income country to assist with the provision of global financial support, medical supplies and, crucially, sharing vaccine supplies. This means providing greater support to those countries we already have connections with, reaching out to other countries in need, and pushing the UK government to do what is morally right and redistribute vaccines to where they are needed.
The UK, Wales being a part of that UK, I think we've got a lot to be proud of. In terms of our country's contribution. That's not to say, of course, that more can't be done, because it can be, but it's certainly right, I think, to highlight that what our country has done in terms of its global response.
Many countries, particularly in Africa, are still experiencing repeated waves of infection sweeping through their communities, every time raising the likelihood of new variants emerging. And if we are truly to call ourselves a globally responsible nation, we have to look for opportunities to give people the tools to help them out in difficult times.
Well, the Health Minister also made the point that the international distribution of vaccines is a matter for the UK government, and she said she has been putting pressure on ministers in Westminster to donate more vaccines internationally. She also said that the Welsh Government is monitoring the situation in Wales to ensure there isn't an excess of vaccine doses that could be better used in other countries around the world.
On a different topic altogether, the Welsh Government lost a vote in the Parliament this week trying to make changes to the Welsh food industry. What happened, Cemlyn?
Yes, so this is on the food bill being brought forward by a Conservative MS, Peter Fox, and he says that the aim of the bill is to deliver more locally sourced food, to improve the sustainability of food production, to reduce food wastage as well by requiring supermarkets, for example, to donate unwanted items to charity and food banks. Let's hear more from the MS.
Ultimately, at the very heart of the bill is to ensure the use of local food, creating local jobs, stimulating local economies together with addressing major well-being and health issues across the length and breadth of Wales. These are points that, again, I believe every politician in this chamber, here or virtual, would support.
I am unable to back the member's bill as proposed because I do believe its implementation would divert us from the priorities I believe we share. But I do also believe there's a lot of proposals, and Peter will be aware of this, in the bill that I don't think require new legislation. However, I'm very keen to back him in his determination to identify ways to strengthen food security and improve well-being through encouraging the supply of the high-quality and sustainable food produced here in Wales.
Leslie Griffiths there explaining why the government wasn't supporting this bill, but in the end it was backed by the Senedd by 27 votes to 22, and so the bill moves on now to its next stage.
Kemlyn, thank you very much. Let's go to the Northern Ireland Assembly and talk to our reporter there, Jim Fitzpatrick. Hello to you. Members have been hearing about a report into historic abuses at so-called mother and baby homes in Northern Ireland. What's been happening?
Yes, this is the latest stage in a dark chapter of our relatively recent history, Joe. It's what to do about around 10,500 women who went through institutions for mother and baby homes. These were women who were often unmarried, pregnant. Some of them were victims of abuse, and their children were often taken for adoption. Now, it's such a complex issue that the Executive asked and set up an independent truth recovery panel to tell them what they should do. Now, the panel has now issued its report. It has suggested not just a public inquiry, but also an ongoing panel to advise the process as they go forward, to work out what they can do about this, find out the information and offer some redress to the victims. Often it's difficult for the Executive to come to agreement, but in this case it wasn't agreement that was difficult, as Michelle O'Neill outlined in her statement to the Chamber.
At the outset, let me say, as always is the case when I speak about this issue, our thoughts are very much with the women and their children who were treated in the most barbaric, inhumane and disrespectful way in these institutions across this island. It can never be forgotten that what we're talking about here, in many cases, is women who've had their babies taken from their arms and moved without their consent across and between jurisdictions. And they're now grown children who do not know their identity, their family or their medical history. The publication of the report represents a major step forward for victims and survivors. I am therefore pleased to inform members that the Executive has agreed all of the recommendations.
On behalf of the committee, I would also like to echo your sentiments that what these women and their children endured should never have happened, and that we must all ensure that it never happens again.
The institutions responsible for this gave it up not because they had some turnaround and change of heart, they gave it up because the profit went out of it. Can I ask the Deputy First Minister, given that some of these institutions sit on vast resources, that she and her colleague, the First Minister, and all Executive Ministers will pursue them throughout to ensure that an adequate and fair recompense is made to the victims of their actions?
Now, it's the Catholic and indeed the Protestant churches who must deal with this issue, and they must cooperate with the statutory authorities in their effort to find out information and offer some redress to the victims.
Jim, we've talked a lot on this programme about the part of the Brexit deal that covers trade in Northern Ireland, known as the Protocol. It's a big issue here, as it is in Stormont. It came up again this week. What happened?
Well, yes, indeed. Lord Frost, the Brexit Minister, is continuing his negotiations with the EU to try and make the protocol more palatable to unionists here in Northern Ireland. He himself was in Northern Ireland this week. But what we had here in the Chamber was the SDLP's Matthew O'Toole urging the First Minister to accept that the protocol was good for some businesses here, notably in this case a local pharmaceutical firm, Almac.
First Minister, earlier this year, the pharmaceutical company Almac described its unique position under the protocol as giving it, quote, unique and its customers unique, seamless, uninterrupted and flexible access to both the UK and European marketplaces. Last week, they announced the creation of 1,000 new jobs here. First Minister, what is it about the potential for economic advantage and job creation that your party wants to throw away? And in your discussions with businesses and business groups, has a single one of those businesses or groups supported your idea of triggering Article 16?
Mr. Speaker, yes, many have indeed, whenever it comes to the engagements that I've had with the business community around a range of issues that are affecting businesses. You only need to look, and I commend the UK Command Paper that was published before the summer, and it gives great detail as to the impacts that the protocol has had. And the member raises his eyebrows and dismisses of it because he is blind and deaf to the reality of what the protocol has done. Such is his sycophantic nature when it comes to being pro-European. He should look at the devastating impact the protocol has had in the diversion of trade away from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. And if he is that concerned about our pharmaceutical companies and medicines, He should listen carefully to the Health Minister. Whenever we have over 90% of all of our medicines that come from Great Britain, the member should really reflect when it comes to his position on the protocol, rather than lecturing me in respect to that issue.
Well, the debate over that trade diversion between Great Britain and Northern Ireland rages on. We don't have detailed figures. We do know that business is up at Northern Ireland's ports, and indeed trade north-south between Northern Ireland and the Republic is up in both directions. Almac, just one of those companies that is benefiting from that dual access to both the EU and the UK market.
Now, vaccine passports in Scotland and COVID passes in Wales, we've talked about them, and now a similar scheme could be on the way in Northern Ireland.
Yes, Joe, we talked about this before. I said it would be back on the agenda if the cases remained high here. Well, it's back on the agenda, and by the middle of December, you will need some sort of COVID passport or a test to get into a pub or restaurant here in Northern Ireland. It was passed at the Executive by 6 votes to 4. Those dissenting and objecting were the DUP. They have an objection in principle to this sort of a check, and they're urging the Health Minister to do more to roll out the booster vaccination programme. And it's funny, I mean, Ian Paisley, the late leader of the DUP and founder, was famously teetotal. He described alcohol as the devil's buttermilk. His portrait hangs behind me in the Great Hall here. And I wonder what he would make now of the sense that his party are almost cheerleaders for unhindered access to the pub.
Food for thought. Jim Fitzpatrick, thank you very much there in Belfast. Back to Westminster and you, Sean. Questions and speculation all week about what the government would finally announce on railways, their plan for railways, particularly high-speed rail. We got that announcement on Thursday. What was in it?
MPs have been waiting for a long time to find out what the government planned to do with railways in the north of England. They had been warned by all the media briefing that the plans were likely to be changed, and indeed, when the Transport Secretary got up in the Commons, he did announce a revised plan.
Today I'm proud to announce our integrated rail plan, a £96 billion programme, which will transform rail services in the North and the Midlands, up to 10 years sooner than previously planned. And Mr Speaker, when I became Transport Secretary in 2019, the HS2 project was already about 10 years old. I was concerned that the costs were rising, that newer projects like the Midlands Rail Hub, the Northern Powerhouse Rail, hadn't been fully factored into those plans. And under the original scheme, the HS2 track would not have reached the East Midlands and the North until the early 2040s. Clearly, a rethink was needed.
He promised HS2 to Leeds. He promised Northern Powerhouse Rail. He promised that the North would not be forgotten. But he hasn't just forgotten us. He's completely sold us out. We were committing to a new line connecting Manchester and Leeds. And within a month of becoming Prime Minister, Boris Johnson said, I'm going to deliver on my commitment with a pledge to fund Leeds to Manchester. We were promised a new line, Mr Speaker. He's broken that promise, and he hasn't even got the decency to admit it.
The Prime Minister promised that HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail was not an either-or option, and those in Leeds and Bradford may be forgiven for viewing it today as neither. This is the danger in selling perpetual sunlight and then leaving it for others to explain the arrival of moonlight.
Salutary warning there from Hugh Merriman on the Conservative Party benches there. He's chair of the Transport Select Committee. What about the government's plans for levelling up different parts of the country?
I think it shows that there's going to be quite a big and continuing debate about levelling up. Labour were quick to say that the rail plans showed that Boris Johnson had failed his first test. What the Transport Secretary and the Prime Minister were saying is these plans are better and will deliver results much sooner. But how it all plays out, well, I think that does remain to be seen.
Well, thank you, Sean. That's all we've got time for today. I'll be back on Monday at 12:15 here on BBC Two. Please join me then. Bye-bye.